Welcome to the Fall 2023 Parsons Communication Design Lecture Series. My name is Nika Simovich-Fisher, and I'm an assistant professor and the Communication Design AAS Program Director here at Parsons. The CD Lecture Series allows students to meet design thinkers and practitioners within the discipline and adjacent fields. You can learn more about the upcoming lectures from the CD app and watch past lectures on our YouTube channel. This is the last lecture of the semester, but are planning another exciting lineup for the spring, so stay tuned for that. I'm thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Kiel Mutschelknaus. Kiel Danger Mutschelknaus is a motion and generative designer based in the DC, Maryland area. Kiel's studio focuses around crafting generative tools to create bespoke typography, image, and motion work. His coding project, Space Type Generator, is an open source tool that allows users to create their own kinetic type experiments. There are currently 16 variations of STG with more on the way. It has been used around the world for everything from music videos to magazine covers to large-scale murals. Kiel's work has been written about in It's Nice That, The Verge, Étapes, Novum Magazine, iMagazine, Type 01, and Page. He has given lectures and workshops internationally, including artist talks at OFFF Tel Aviv, Tipografía México, Encontrao de Tipografia in Portugal, and soon OFFF Barcelona. He has also exhibited internationally with his work appearing in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and New York City. He helps clients and agencies develop their own tools for creating and generating custom graphics and motions, with work done for IBM, Nike, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Adidas, and editorial work done for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The New Yorker, MIT Technology Review, and Barron's Magazine. Please help me introduce Kiel. Welcome.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much for having me. As I've been mentioning, I'm a huge fan of this lecture series. I watch it all the time on YouTube, and I'm like a little bit excited, but also a little terrified to see myself up on there. So hopefully this goes well, and I don't have to cringe when I watch it. So thank you, everybody, for having me. Thank you, Elaine, for organizing and helping me with the details. I am Kiel D. Mutschelknaus. The D is for danger. And I'm going to talk about designing tools and not designing designs. Over the past few years in my studio practice, I've really focused on creating work with code. Processing in P5.js is about 95% of what you're going to see up here today. And lots of these tools I maybe create for kind of compositional exercises to kind of see what's possible with interaction and using it to generate visuals. Other times I'm using them to create certain effects, wondering if some of the tools I use in a traditional design context could be reinterpreted through code and motion graphics. Is kind of my other area. So seeing what we can do with code in these spaces to make it more generative, more manipulative, and to be able to share it with people. And sometimes these tools and exercises lend themselves to a commercial context, whether they're creating for illustration or editorial, or whether some of the lessons I've learned in some of the generators lend themselves to things I would recreate in After Effects or Illustrator. And then some of these tools make their way online to spacetypegenerator.com, where there is several generators you can interact with. And that's a lot of the fun with these generators, is the manipulating them in real time. And it's so satisfying that bringing it to an interactive context was really important. And some of them are pretty, direct and bespoke in their applications, whereas others are very complicated and compositional and kind of a bunch of generators nested inside of each other. And they've been used in a variety of different contexts. This is a mural in a city in Romania, which is maybe the biggest application of STG at the moment. Still always aim higher, I guess. And then over there, it's actually at Red Rock behind Porter Robinson, the electronic artist, pulled up like an STG during the performance. He didn't ask me, but it's okay. It's okay. It's at Red Rock, so that's pretty cool. And then other times I've created generators for corporate clients to help them either create something that they had planned theoretically and to help them generate kind of a large body of work. And when we place these visuals and motions inside of code and give the user, whether it's an agency or a in-house team or something, the ability to manipulate these, you get lots of really great, really wild, interesting results. Okay, so I organized this presentation. Usually I do this chronologically, but history starts to pile up and everything gets really dense and confusing. So this time I did something that I think is really fun. We'll see if you think it's really fun. I organized these by mathematical and coding principles. I couldn't help myself but try and fit in some math lessons here. So hopefully you right brain folks think this is fun. So let's start with a sine wave, okay? So we're gonna start with some of these simple things, and I get a lot of questions about like how these generators, how these things are made. And of course there's the coding aspect of it, which is super important, but also ultimately kind of easy, right? You like look it up online and you just type in the lines of code. But for me, the more interesting thing is these underlining engines or principles or structures that then manifest themselves in really dynamic ways. And one of those simple things that then we can extrapolate into really extravagant machines is a sine wave, right? And this is very simple. I'll keep the trig to, well, no, there's going to be a fair amount of trig in here, so apologies. But a sine wave is really great because if you stick a increasing number inside of the sine function, you get a oscillating value between 1 and -1, and this is a very kind of smooth, beautiful, accelerated looping graphic that can go forward and backward, and you can manipulate it in lots of different ways. You can make it bigger, you can make it smaller, slower. You can add waves on top of waves. That third one is actually a circle because we have a wave along the y-axis as well, which is really exciting. But once we start doing this on an order of magnitude, it gets super exciting. So this is the same animation we saw, but what if you added a slider to offset them in time? You get instantly gratifying wave motion. When in doubt, add a sine wave. I think that's pretty much the lesson here. And then if you like overclock some of these values, you can get these like really great correlations between the motions. And as long as we have like one wave, it's code, so we can like duplicate it over and over again. So this is that same thing, but what if we offset it vertically as well? And then you can get these very extravagant looking waves, dimensional almost, even though it's in a 2D context very quickly. And then, it's code, so we've got access to all these data and values, so we can reference back on values we found already and create these really dynamic waves really quickly. And so this was a lot of what early space type generator, a lot of what my early type experiments were, coding experiments were, was just like adding waves to certain values. So here we've got like a wave just on the x-axis going back and forth, and then also linking up those position waves with a change in scale of type. Or we can go vertical, and then matching it with some graphics and some colors, and then also playing with some of the slope of that curve, making it steeper so that we can get a little bit more snap. Because before this, I still do a lot of motion graphic stuff, and acceleration's a real key with some of this. So figuring out how that can manifest itself in code is super satisfying. And then we have position, and then we can also do scale, so we can like scale things and constrain them and create these like really great textural pieces really quickly. And lots of the early spacetypegenerator.com generators are just all waves, If you can master that sine wave, you've got the keys to the kingdom. You can do like all of this. So lots of 2D wave stuff, but also some 3D wave stuff. So thinking about not just in an X and Y value, but also in a Z space, what could also manifest those waves. And even recently, I've still done some of these waves. A couple months ago, I did this, what looks like a weaving thing, but is really just a series of sine waves, offset in time, and then with some like tricky dimension going on back and forth between it. And then still even more recently, maybe this is like a year ago. So here we've got like a wave in the X one, but also these graphics are made of tiny little strips of type, rasterized into images, and then I rasterize a bunch of different ones along a variable, with a variable typeface. And so now each one of those slides is also undulating along with it. It's being mapped along with a different weight of it to kind of give you this flowing field between it. So about a year ago, the mill approached me about working on this identity for IBM's Quantum Summit, and it was called The Next Wave, and they had heard that I knew what a sine wave was, so they're like, let's talk to Kiel, he knows what to do. So this is like kind of a very fun project. I mean, IBM, Quantum Summit, I don't know barely what quantum words mean, but it became like a really kind of a fruitful ground for a bunch of these experiments. And their theme was the next wave, but they also like the idea of constructive interference, which is when you have two waves that then would collide, and sometimes they can be constructive, where they stack up and get much bigger, or destructive, where they kind of cancel each other out. So throughout the following examples, you're going to see some of these waves that have a pretty distinct sine wave value, but also maybe hiccup a little bit, or you might feel like they're kind of undulating in a kind of an awkward way, and that's because most of these waves are being derived from this constructive and deconstructive wave interference. So it started real basic, and for me this is like a dream project. I got to work with some really great designers that I've looked up to, so interacting with them in a project was super satisfying to every day kind of see what people have done, have feedback, respond to like what was being created by other designers. So here we have some like very simple sine waves again, some graphics being stretched across those sine waves. Other ones were kind of very two-dimensional, so here we've got something that would appear very still, but then could be then expanded as if there's kind of more dimensions hidden behind it. We had some very kind of clear examples of constructive and deconstructive experiments. Okay, you can't see my mouse, but it's okay. There's some blue dots on that one, and each one of them is kind of like pumping a wave. And so then you can actually see how those waves would interact with each other. And sometimes the waves are offset, and so it kind of creates this like really great texture for everything. And then we got real weird with it. Again, all of the work I was doing was made in processing, so it was all in a coded environment that we could like click around and interact with, and became super satisfying. This was maybe my favorite kind of experiment I did, where we created the type, and then I applied a bunch of particles to it, and then if you can see, there's some two blue dots, and each one of those dots is creating a wave, and then you can, as you move them around, see how they would affect these particles, and then you can see some really great pattern examples of when they're interacting, when they're getting closer to each other. It led to some really great textures, some really great kind of dissipation in what the type read like. Yes, and then with the waves, I've primarily been experimenting with them in position, but it doesn't have to just be position, right? We could scale them, skew them, rotate them. So some of these experiments are a grid of type, pretty straightforward, but then with several different waves applied to it from the top left and the bottom right corner, and then having them hit each other, and how does that manifest? How does that look? Still more of those, and this also I think was really satisfying to look at. This is that same grid, but as the letters get smaller, they make way for other letters, so the resolution of the grid gets really tiny, and it starts to feel kind of like some digital artifacts or some anti-aliasing going on there, like a really kind of low-res image caught, between these waves. Also kind of has like a fabric textural kind of pattern to it that I really loved. What was settled on was something much simpler, which is great. I think that project, this whole research and development process really lent itself to my baser instinct of like doing everything times 1,000, like keep pushing it, overworking. What was settled on was this kind of very simple, elegant wave that I quite liked. Yes, so let's go back to the wave, right? Simple sine wave. What is another thing we could do to this, aside from what we did with IBM? We could add feet to it, right? So if we just look at the body or the torso, I'll try not to demonstrate on my body too much, but if you think of the body moving up and down as also sort of a wave, and then you match that with kind of a half a wave with the feet and kind of capping them at the bottom, you get like a walk cycle. A few years ago, I was really obsessed with walk cycles when I was working in After Effects, and it's such a beautiful challenge to try and figure out how to make a body move fluidly, naturally. And at the end of the day, it's just kind of a bunch of nested loops and waves kind of bouncing up and down. And in the earlier example, I showed like a line of offset waves. But what if you took those offset sine waves, but then like embedded them inside of each other or hinged them on top of each other? And then you get kind of like a very kind of natural, like the trunk of your body as you walk is kind of a bunch of nested sine waves and loops, which is really exciting. So I recreated this in code with some type and some graphics. And ones you could, of course, then interact with. And this sent me down a long rabbit hole that continues to this day. With textures, these are some procedurally generated textures and patterns that were then applied to randomly sized bodies and legs and heads, and amount of heads, and then like crowns and head. I don't know what they are on top of each other, but they're all kind of linked to each other, so they create this like kind of fun nested sine wave flowing back and forth. And like I became really overwhelmed with the amount of possibilities. Earlier I said put a slider on it. If you don't know what to do, I mean, there were so many sliders. It scared me, so I didn't know like how to share this online. So there's no generator online yet to interact with these, but maybe one of these days I'll figure out the nice package to put it in. But it has found its way into some exhibition spaces. So I worked with Dimension Plus, which is a group of kind of experiential interactive designers, exhibition designers, for this exhibition in Taiwan. And this was actually interactive with the viewer. There were 3 knobs in front of you. And one of the knobs was to select the character. And then another one was for the height. And then another one to kind of re-roll and select a new character. The walkers also have made their way into editorial. I worked with Point 5 here in New York. They work with Columbia Engineering's publication. And they created this digital publication for the aging issue. And they love the idea of these bodies kind of manifesting and being very robotic in code, and then like seeing how they could convey some of these augmentations to the body through it. And so I crafted a few of these through code. There are a couple from After Effects, but what I'm really proud of is the kind of ability for them to seamlessly, hopefully, integrate into each other, where the ones that are created in After Effects kind of match, pretty elegantly, I hope, with the ones that are walking. And my favorite one was this giant one for an article about the brain, about updating the brain. And this was, all created in code, just kind of taking some of these objects, embedding them inside each other, and duplicating them over and over again. I also, as I'm coding, sometimes will debug stuff by sticking values in the walkers or in certain aspects to kind of see what the value is at that time. And for this one, it was fun to just kind of leave it in there as some sort of additional element or some sort of schematic piece of it. And then currently, the walkers are in Hong Kong. I just recently wrapped this again with Dimension Plus for a mall space where they've got all these screens, and now there's tons of walkers on those screens. And I don't have any documentation of it yet, and that's killing me. I was like, I'm talking to Parsons in a couple days. Please send me documentation, and crickets. So maybe they're on the screens, maybe they're not. Maybe we could all go and check it out. But those are right now, and looking at this, you can hopefully see some of those sine waves happening. Okay, next trig lesson. Polar to Cartesian coordinates, drawing a circle, right? This is another kind of elegant use of a sine wave. If you remember back to your trig and lessons, is one way we can plot along an x and y is to use a cosine wave and a sine wave in conjunction, and then you can create these really beautiful, simple circles. And you're like, what's the big deal, Kiel? I know how to draw a circle. Do you? Do you? I'm sure you do. But in code, we can do like really great, exciting things with these. You can place them in 3D space so you can look at the circles at a different angle so that they appear to be dimensional. And then add a sine wave to it, right? You can add like lots of different waves to different aspects of it to get these like really beautiful, elegant flowing forms. Sine waves are always satisfying. Or you can change the scale of the surfaces of them. So here's some letters that are scaling differently on the surface of one of those drawn circles. Of course, the classic cylinder where you're stretching type and graphics over top of them. Here on the left, there's each one of those modules is manipulative, so you can like kind of move them around and create your own compositions. I also use this technique really heavily with this illustration for Kraken. which is a crypto space for their year in review in 2021, stacking just a bunch of these cylinder structures on top of themselves. Other times, here's for editorial, where that same sort of X and Y, the angles to the radius was used to create this textural element that then was placed in as a texture on top of a different illustration done in After Effects. These are all pretty simple, but I've pushed it in some of the online ones. There's this polar to Cartesian coordinate translation in lots of my generators, but maybe like the most present it is in this badge generator, which is just a series of this idea over and over again embedded inside of itself. Sometimes dimensional, sometimes half and then stretched and then applied. This is online for people to use, and it's maybe like the most complicated space type generator out there. It's so many of these different generators. Well, it's basically like I took all the generators before it and kind of crammed it into one space. But still super satisfying. I've been meaning to revisit it and clean it up because, talk about sliders. I had to collapse the sliders in on each other so that there would be room for more sliders. Another super complicated one was a recent one I did with clocks called Analog. And this one uses a variable typeface. There's 3 different variable typefaces, and yeah, depending on the time, the type will somehow draw more attention to itself, whether it's getting heavier or wider, whatever the variable typeface would allow. And this one was needlessly complicated. Well, I don't know. I don't know if it's needlessly complicated. I would love somebody else to take a look at it and tell me what I did wrong here. But this is just a ton of these little sectors inside of each other, pushing and pulling. But the end result is, I think, is really kind of satisfying clock where you can craft lots of different ones. And there's also settings for time flies in case you just want to watch it flow around like you see on the left there. And then lots of fun gradients for the different textures to kind of draw more emphasis, because really, ultimately, it's kind of a failure of a clock. It's really hard to read. But underneath, I think it's really interesting what's going on is each one of those sections of numbers, each number, is being drawn on as a texture, and then that texture is being animated. So each one has a certain amount of steps from its inactive space to its fully active, so from its very thin to its very thick and heavy to draw attention to itself. And because that's variable and it pushes back and forth, each one of these pie pieces has to push all of the other ones around it. But because that doesn't all happen uniformly, depending on if you've got a 40 or a 1, those require different lengths. They all have to do it kind of dynamically, which is really complicated, but also really fun. So. Another thing that I've did with this polar to Cartesian coordinate is tackle the New Yorker magazine. We wanted to recreate this stacked ticker tape sort of look, which is like an experiment you see on the left there that I'd done previously. That looked good, but I have no idea how it works. I don't know why it does have somewhat satisfying curves to it. I just threw a bunch of sine waves in there, and eventually it looked somewhat decent. So I recorded my screen, and that was it. So when the New Yorker said, "Well, can we do this, but have a little bit more control over it, or craft something that doesn't look so chaotic?" I had no idea what to do. So I turned to my favorite polar to Cartesian coordinate translation here. So here it is in a basic one, and so then I started to think, I had tried earlier to take these cylinders and embed them, but then it kind of just looks like a chain, and you also can't trick the viewer into thinking that it's one continuous piece of ticker tape. But then I found this really great formula for something called a trefoil knot, which is kind of like a Mobius strip, but also a Mobius strip times 2. And that looks complicated, but really at the end of the day, it's kind of like a sine wave, the polar to Cartesian equation inside of itself, 2 or 3 times, and with a z-axis. And what this presented was this really beautiful kind of folded tape. And I knew I couldn't get that ticker tape illusion just by using cylinders, but what if we took a bunch of the trefoil knots and embedded them inside of each other? And that did end up working pretty good. So these are some early experiments that we did to kind of give the sense of a mass of tape, of ribbon all holding some of these interviews together. But what we ended up with was a much more kind of subtle version of it, where the tape was kind of done in a more symmetrical fashion. I kind of still like the chaos of these, the scribbled nature of these. But the organization of this is pretty satisfying. And then it looped really nicely. Oh, one other thing before we go. This is kind of what it looks like in processing. And one fun thing here is there is those like controls on the left. And this was kind of a fun challenge because like placing all of those in just the code would have been impossible. So what I had to do was create kind of a UI to place each one of those and rotate them in space. So it was kind of like a compositional tool inside of a generator, which kind of I find happening over and over again. So yeah, it loops really nicely in the article. And then I use the same sort of strips for some of the pull quotes. Okay, so I know we got the circle down, but are we ready for the sphere? So this is the same sort of idea, but now with the z dimension. And it maybe looks complicated, but again, there's still that kind of basic idea of a circle equation, but now there's kind of another half one, because really what is a sphere but like a stack of circles that are then tapered at the top and bottom. And so that's why you see maybe another kind of wave inside a sine and cosine relationship, but it's only half of it. So anyway, this sphere I found to play with was super exciting, super fun. Of course, I had to throw some waves in there, throw some type in there, kind of see what would happen. And I find myself making these spheres for a variety of different projects. Here's one for the Wall Street Journal where I created the sphere and then wrapped it in some texture I made in Illustrator for this Web 1.0 planet being eclipsed by a much sleeker one. So all those were recorded inside of processing and then composited inside of After Effects. And then this is also a use of that great sphere equation. This was work done with work order for New York Times Climate Forward. They had approached me and they'd been trying to figure out what to do for the identity for this Climate Forward conference. They knew they wanted waves and textures and maybe something that alluded to heat waves, topography, all of this sort of weather kind of atmosphere going on. And what they had initially had was some pretty simple exercises of wrapping those sorts of ideas around a sphere. And so when they came to me, they were wondering how could we take this sort of idea and then manifest it bigger, make it more generative and more modular, so applying this kind of in a different way where we could make images with it. This is a really great process because I got in early on this art direction phase and was able to respond with some experiments that were made inside of processing so that we knew right away what could be done and what it would maybe end up looking like. Again, kind of like that IBM thing, there's just a fun weeks of days of iteration, of feedback, of responding, and kind of creating our own ideas of some of these concepts and remixing them and then responding to feedback. And then what we finally settled on was some of these layers. Here we have layers that are kind of concentric inside of each other. But then we were thinking, what else could we do with those layers? And so what eventually happened was we took that sphere, the sphere equation we just looked at, and then rather than having the lines, the connection of these layers connect with the top or latitudinally and longitudinally, we just pulled it all towards the center. So you got these really great kind of fluted structures that feel floral, organic, like they're wind, kind of going on. And what it looks like is this when you get in there. And on the left, you have the base structure with no gradient or no kind of image or texture applied to it. And you can kind of see all the different points that are being applied to it. And then, of course, there's waves applied to it. And then on the right, we also have this gradient that's being drawn in the background and then stretched along these fluted structures. And then those are also then animated. So, you've got the animation of the waves of these layers and then also the gradient flowing through it to yield some really satisfying results. And then those are offset, depending on position. So you can offset it in a number of different ways to create lots of different effects. And then it became evident that the whole sphere was good, but really zoning in and looking at specific little pieces of it texturally became super exciting and satisfying. So at the end of the day, we kind of blew up the sphere so it bled off the canvas. And then what then ended up filling it was kind of just these textural wave shapes in kind of super satisfying way. And then the work order team was just super great at matching it and cropping it and figuring out all these different configurations. It's so satisfying to see somebody use a tool in ways you hadn't really considered. So their experimentation with color and with waves was really exciting. Okay, let's do another one. This time we're leaving behind trig, and we're going to talk about a palette packing algorithm. This I found to be really interesting. This is a really interesting challenge, pallet packing algorithm. So it's like if you had a pallet and you were shipping a bunch of stuff and you had a bunch of different containers, how would you optimally ship them on a pallet to be efficient time-wise, or to deal with certain boxes, or if you knew all the boxes that you need to fit in, how would you do that? What is the most effective way? Or if you had a constantly flowing series of packages, how would you fit that in? But this was in 3D. Luckily for me, the screens are 2D, so I was just going to work with a palette packing algorithm on a 2D scale, which is much easier. So I tried to do this inside of code, and to varying degrees of success. I think what I wanted to do was try and figure out if I took a canvas or space, could I fill that with a bunch of different logos? That was like the real rough brief of experimentation in my head. And the answer is yes, you can, but should you? Which is always the question. So some of these experiments kind of worked out okay, and then I tried to do it 3D, which I cheated obviously here because it's actually just thin layers. But some of the results were pretty interesting, and it was the idea of taking a space and filling it with these graphics and then allowing them to push and pull each other away from themselves to get different sort of compositions. And so this is what the final thing looked like. And it was kind of a fun exercise to do. But as I was doing it, I was kind of thinking that this same sort of idea of filling a space with certain size boxes, that is, if we unify them into the order in which they're sized, or if the size stays the same, that's very similar to type layout, right? So could we take the same sort of palette packing algorithm, and then rather than just doing it straight for a text box, could we then fill it with other things? And so this led me eventually to create Space Type Generator Construct, this construct version which allows a user to type in a language. It's satisfying to type it in, but it also gets a little strobe-like. So copying and pasting is also helpful. But what this does is it kind of takes some padding in the space of your canvas and fills it with the type, but then also a variety of other graphics and animations that are then thrown in. It's a very kind of insular application, but still kind of satisfying to play around with. And when I shared this online, a great duo from India called Thrukrol and Tagra approached me about helping them with an installation they had been assigned to do for the store in Mumbai that was just opening. And so they approached me with some of their great work. They have these really beautiful paintings that are kind of collage and also feeling very digital. And they had this idea of, for the store installation on the iPads, having the ability for users to click and kind of compose their own poems that would then be filled in with some of their collaged work together. And so this is what eventually we came up with, was a system where they could kind of type their own, they could choose from these poems that they had written and then kind of construct their own composition together. And then also, once that was done, throw them into this generator that feels a little bit like Construct, but now has more options, or the ability to have them flow along on these choreographed motions and animations. And then users could export statics or animations and share them online. This was really fun to kind of see somebody else's interpretation of something I had done and then push it kind of in this new context. And so then during the store display, it was on all of the iPads as users were kind of visiting it and interacting with the technology. I've also used this palette packing approach when it comes to the newest space type generator, Crash, which is physics-based, but it does a similar sort of thing where it looks at the size and the words you've typed in and the line breaks, and then you fills that space either with type or with images that you can then upload that will also have physics. Physics is always fun. It's always fun to throw stuff on your canvas and break stuff. So this has a ton of different options. Sometimes the words are connected together. The letters are actually connected together. Other times they're loose. Other times they're in blocks. You can also have a mixture of it. And I just updated this a couple days ago where I think now a gyroscope on your phone will work. I don't know, don't call me on that, but let me troubleshoot it a little bit more. But you can still try it on your phone. It's always satisfying. Okay, I think this is maybe my final concept here, object-oriented programming, which sounds complicated, but really at the end of the day is a pretty kind of straightforward approach to programming. It's the idea that, each one of these, I guess in a generative sense, it's the idea that each one of these elements that's created, rather than just having it draw a rectangle, you can say draw an object that is a rectangle, and then that object should also hold maybe a variety of other information, or you could interact with that object in a certain specific way. In this example, we can click and drag each one of these object Bezier paths, right? And each one has a handle, and each one has an angle, and you can interact with them by holding it around. So each one of those you can maybe consider as an object. And this is an approach that I've been doing more and more in all of my pieces, and it's really been exciting to see, like, if we create one thing that has this amount of information and this amount of interaction in it, how can we then extrapolate that and do it over and over again, and where can we go using that sort of level of interaction? So here's a couple ideas. Maybe some of them have physics, as we looked at earlier. Maybe other ones are individual little space type configurations that then you can move around and manipulate. Here's some more ideas of the Bezier handles. If you grab those, like, what can we link between them to look exciting and interesting? And how to, like, the logic of it bending and stuff move around. So you've maybe seen here that these individual Bezier paths, are like objects that we can move around. So I've been also kind of connecting them with Bezier paths. And so this was space type generator string that I played around with. I'm a big fan of Illustrator and Bezier paths, and those have always made sense to me. And so figuring out how to do it in code was a huge challenge, but also super satisfying, and led to a lot of fruitful experiments. Some of these are layered. Some of these are taking the path between these objects and these Bezier paths and, like, layering objects inside of them. And so I posted string online, and then got an email from Michael Boswell when he was at Spotify, and he was showing me what they were planning for Wrapped 21, and it was a lot of mock-ups using space type generator string, and that kind of, like, blew me away. That was so exciting to see their interpretation of it, what they wanted to do with it, and all of these kind of weird artifacts and scaling and slicing of the type that was happening. That's kind of what they liked about it. And this was during, like, the type skew controversy of, like, what we should be doing with type. But I was, like, all for it. I was like, let's skew it. And so they asked me to maybe do some more motion experiments for how it could manifest itself. And they had shown me some of the compositions they had made using it, which are all very great. So here are some experiments. When you're kind of laying out your stuff around Bad Bunny, that's, like, super fun and satisfying and mind-bending. And so here it is in an actual generator where you could kind of play around with the different layers and kind of how that would look. And this has a motion component that wasn't in the final campaign. And I would love to have tackled a tool, but the needs for this are global, right? For a Spotify Wrapped campaign for all around the world. The needs for this tool were, like, taken care of by much more capable hands than me at the time. So it was really exciting to see what eventually resulted. And now maybe a question you might be asking yourself is, like, did I have anything to do with the Threads campaign? No, I didn't. But if you go to spacetypegenerator.com/string, you can make your own Threads fan work, because you can get so close, so terrifyingly close to what they ended up with their campaign. So go ahead and give it a shot, and you can make your own threads. All right, that's what I got. I think we got some time for a question and answer. Great, thank you.
Is all the project based on P5.js?
Yeah, great question. Lots of the stuff that lives online is P5.js, and P5 is a JavaScript library meant to replicate processing. But some of the stuff that was more heavy intensive and didn't need to live online was processing. So if you're working with something that you need like really great outputs really quickly and easily, I think processing is the way to go. If you're needing something that's interactive for a wide swath of people to use, yeah, P5.js. But like the climate forward one, that one needed to exist as processing app because it had so much more output requirements, size requirements, and it's just easier to get a really great output out of processing.
Thank you so much.
We'll do you, and then I'm gonna walk over there. Here you go.
I was wondering, like when you discovered that you could like do these types of works.
Yeah, great question. I started in motion graphics and After Effects, playing around with some code. There's a really great ability using expressions, and expressions in After Effects are these like layer of code you can put on your layers to manipulate them. And when I was doing that, I've just found myself making more and more sine waves and then linking those to variables and sliders inside of After Effects to kind of manipulate certain effects. And at some point, it just became really obvious that it should just live as code rather than live inside of After Effects. It kind of felt eventually like I was coding inside of After Effects on those expression layers. And it kind of became a hindrance because the rendering of After Effects was actually holding a bunch of this processing back. And so then when I brought it all out, I had a rough knowledge of how to use processing, but when I brought it all out and put it in that environment, I mean, it was, like the gates opened. It was really satisfying to see all this stuff that I had waited so long to render in After Effects just happen instantaneously. So somehow by kind of stripping away some of those tools to like a really bare bones environment, it became, super fruitful.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the early morning math lesson. It was really cool. My question was kind of similar to the last one, but I guess to build on it, I was very curious how you kind of learned to do all this. Did you just self-teach, or were you like in a course or something?
Yeah, I guess I almost minored in math, so like I kind of have a math leaning mentality and approach to certain things, and I think that suited me well for thinking about everything in terms of code. So I guess the trig and some of that stuff and variables and values and like manipulating them with math didn't scare me so much. So I felt like that was approachable. And then the actual using code and learning code, that was all self-taught. But like if you do motion graphics, it's a lot of the same principles. It's a lot of things looping over and over again and then changing values inside of that loop to create interesting motions and interactions. So I guess inkling to math and then motion graphics kind of added together, and then learning the language and processing is like, just Googling, right? And watching Daniel Schiffman. Daniel Schiffman, if you are interested in coding, is like, just watch his YouTube channel. Watch his YouTube channel and then think, what about that, but with typography? And, that's my path, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really amazing work. So I'm an industrial designer here, so not typically in communication design. So I'm wondering if you have ever thought about, all this type of like cool motion graphic generated design. They're all like right now happening in digital world. But is there any possibility to bring all this kind of dynamic aspect into a physical product or a spatial place? And what may be the tangible aspect or possibility for all this type of work?
Yeah, I don't know. Let's talk, right? You have those answers. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I've been in some installations, but those are just projections. But I have seen some like really exciting stuff with 3D prints, like 3D prints and frames and motion, and trying to figure out how maybe 3D printing or physical manifestations of certain frames or steps of something could lend themselves. So I don't know what the physical manifestation of it is, but I do think there's a lot of exciting things in maybe bringing some of these into a 3D context that you could almost like a cubist painting envision some of these things occurring all at once in some sort of physical thing. So I don't have a great answer, but maybe you can let me know what to do. Okay.
Hello. Hey, Kiel.
Hey.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. Also, I love the use of editorial new. It's one of my favorite fonts right now, typefaces. But
Same.
the question I had was about moving from After Effects to coding and what that means for commercial projects, because I always felt like screen recording something on your laptop, does it scale well on those larger installations, or is there another way to like capture it at its highest quality?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. Something I deal with like on a daily basis is how can we take these simple things that are maybe being generated in a browser, but envision them on a printable scale or a larger scale. It's hard. I think when you're thinking of P5.js, this got brought up earlier, that is hard to do, or scale something outside of your browser or screen reliably and then being able to see the whole output of what you're generating. That is a challenge. So again, for me, it's like processing is maybe the answer there, is working in a generator that handles those sizes better, that doesn't have to rely on security or permissions through a browser or something. But yeah, it is a challenge, and figuring out like how to handle like a client's expectations or needs from a generator with what can be done, with the functionality they want, whether it's living online or whether they're open to the idea of downloading, processing, running a generator, and figuring out and troubleshooting some of this with me. So I don't know, for me, it's like kind of every project necessitates a new need. And that's fun, but also like kind of this realm I didn't imagine myself being in, which is kind of like a programmer, right? Or taking somebody else's needs and requirements or visuals and then trying to interpret them in a way that is still maybe satisfying and creative, but also fulfills all their needs. So yeah, but like there's still, like I mentioned, the expressions inside of After Effects, that's still a way to go. The final Spotify Wrapped campaign, the 2021 one that I was involved in the art direction on, was eventually then created inside of After Effects through plugins and some sort of embedded structure.
It seems like a lot of your commissioned work comes out of an art director seeing something that was self-initiated and saying, hey, can you do this, but for a client? And so how do you maintain the balance between self-initiated, or I guess, like, how does the dialogue between self-initiated and commissioned work happen? And also, do you ever get commissioned work that's like more of a blank canvas rather than something that's applying a specific approach?
Yeah, totally. This is such a great question. I mean, it's a little bit of mixture of everything, and when everything's going nicely, it's like, yeah, you post something, you share some sort of self-initiated work, and it resonates with some art director, and you end up on like their Instagram feed, and like boom, you get like an email, and that's great. But that balance is also always hard, because if you get then like too much work, then you don't post, and then when the work like stops, then you've got to like ramp that back up again. And yeah, it's a tough correlation between like where to put your focus, how much to focus on it, and hopefully in the end there's like a balance of everything. So yeah, a lot of my work does come from people resonating with a piece or an approach. But sometimes, there's hopefully, you don't become like a piece, you become like a feed, like you become like a body of work that then when they look at it, they think like, well, we've got this challenge, I bet Kiel could do this, judging on all these pieces we've seen before. And so that was a little bit of what the IBM one was like, we've got this wave, it's kind of in the ballpark of generative and sinusoidal motion, and like we feel like this is maybe in the ballpark, and then just cut me and some of these other designers loose and just kind of let us go for it. And so that was a really satisfying thing. So, I mean, it's a mixture of everything, and I don't think that there's a really clear example of like, spend this much time doing this. I don't know that balance yet, so.
I was wondering if, how generative AI and all kinds of AI are popping up, and I was wondering if, not if you were afraid, or maybe if you were excited, like what's the spectrum of how this work would translate if put in a generative AI model, or if someone were to like prompt engineer it really closely to how your work shows.
Yeah, quit giving people ideas. Stop. I don't know. I think I'm like everybody, right? Here in the visual creative industry, where it's like, yeah, it's scary. It's also really exciting, and I can't tell how future-proof this work is, you know, like, and maybe that goes for everybody here, is like, you know, not, if you would ask anybody, you know, a couple years ago if AI would ever replace a creative industry, and, you know, it'd been a resounding no. And then last year I was like, oh, well, they just got, you know, the static image folk, you know, like us motion people are fine. No, we're not fine, you know. So I think it is scary. But I do wonder, like, you know, kind of the bespoke nature of some of these generators is maybe a little bit what will shelter this body of work, generative work, a little bit, is when a client comes with like a very specific need or a very specific visual, to prompt engineer that correctly, I think takes a lot of work. And again, maybe in the future, next year, it'll be super easy to do. But I don't know, I think there's some interaction here and some very specific needs that hopefully generative work has niched down into that will be kind of very hard to you know, replicate in a generative fashion. But yeah, I mean, I think AI is like, you know, it's super exciting. It is exciting, but yeah, no, it's terrifying. So I think being friends with it maybe is the right way to go. I don't know.
Two more. There. Pass it over.
Hello. Thank you so much for showing your work. It's all just so cool, and there's just so much going on. I tried to understand as much as I could, but I think my right brain stopped working after high school. I was kind of curious because I went on the spacetypegenerator.com, and it seems to be like an open source thing where anyone can use it. I was kind of curious to know whether you have any control on who or what uses it and how it's being used and like the ethical implications of that, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. I haven't really, you know, dove into that. I say it's open source because it is on GitHub, and anybody is kind of welcome to comb through the code and maybe grab it. And for me, that's a really exciting aspect, is that maybe somebody will come along and fix something or add some new functionality someplace, or will embed it into their website. That's something that I would love to see a little bit more of, is somebody taking it. And I think for me, like, the genesis of Space Type Generator was kind of come from a very amateur mindset. I was teaching myself to code, so I didn't really know what I was doing. And so there's lots of structural and organizational stuff that is just an absolute disaster. And so then there's that layer, and then it just kept building on that layer. So it's very messy, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So the open source nature of it, like, yeah, I would love people to come along and maybe poke through it, but I'm also not super confident that that's easy to do, because it is such a mess. And, you know, that's like on a long list of things to do, is to go back, revisit some of those earlier ones, clean them, add functionality, add save, you know, add ability to upload your own type, and revisit some of that. And then maybe it'll become more approachable for people to grab onto it and use it. So for me, a transformative aspect of it is really exciting. For me, it's less exciting and more scary if it's just a straight copy and paste. You know, like, that for me doesn't feel. I mean, you know, that's not transformative. I don't think that's in the nature of open source to do something like that. But you know, I'm always excited by what I see people do with the tools. So figuring out like a next step together would be really exciting. But again, it's just like so messy, and so maybe I just need to go in there and clean it up someday or month.
Thank you.
And final question?
Thank you. Hey, Kiel, thanks for coming out today. You talked a little bit about like the limitations of resolution with P5. Have you run into any other, or do you think there's like an upper limit of what can be done with the HTML canvas versus regular processing?
In terms of P5, yeah, you know, I think there's much better libraries out there that, you know, again, my long list of to-dos, you know, I would love to look into, you know, other WebGL environments to work in, 3JS, et cetera, because I think P5 does have some limitations in how it's drawing and how it's operating. You know, some of these space type generators like really chug along. if you get too many points in there, if you're running too many equations. But I know that's just like the nature of the beast with coding. But yeah, there is a limit that I hit quite often in terms of like, is P5 the right environment to be constructing this in? And sometimes no, lots of times no. So I do need to kind of experiment, learn, and that's again a next step for the evolution is figuring out like what other libraries, what other approaches, boundaries can I press with the HTML canvas, because there's definitely better libraries out there that I need to get into. Yeah.
All right. How about another round of applause for Kiel?